All right. And with that work for SAMHSA's CAPT, this year I'm actually working with 13 of SAMHSA's grantees that received funding for the First Responders Comprehensive Addiction and Recovery Act. So I'll be working with them to help address the opioid epidemic. I'm really excited about that, to really be able to bring law enforcement into those efforts. And then again, the Illinois Higher Education Center. And before that was when I was a campus police officer at Eastern Illinois University. And what was great, I was the crime prevention officer. And serving in this role opened up a lot of doors for me to be able to collaborate across campus. And that's where I really learned about prevention and evidence-based prevention, harm reduction strategies. And so that's what made me move from enforcement to prevention, essentially wanting to move further upstream. And I will be sharing some of those fun police stories with you today. But to set a real quick foundation, because I'm going to refer to this a little bit later in the webinar as well, this would be SAMHSA's SPIF, the Strategic Prevention Framework. This is a good foundation to guide and drive your prevention efforts. It all starts with assessment, capacity building, planning, implementation, and then evaluation. So we're going to come back to this just briefly a little bit later in the webinar, but I wanted to give you a quick look at it before we brought it up again later. So, all right, the prevention approaches. You've got your individual approach, your environmental approach, and then the goal, the one that we all want to strive for, is that comprehensive approach. Some prevention interventions, they're designed to help individuals develop the intentions and the skills to act in a healthy manner. Whereas the others, they focus on creating environments that support healthy behavior. But the research does indicate that the most effective prevention interventions incorporate both approaches. Now, we can devote our resources to an individual approach with what is happening with one individual. Now, this is important in some cases, particularly when an intervention or treatment is needed, and it's not to be minimized. The second means for changing behavior on a community level is that environmental approach, taking a look at what is going on around a person within the larger environment. And real quick on the individual level strategies, many prevention approaches focus on helping people develop the knowledge, attitudes, and skills that they need to change their behavior. Now, often these individual level strategies include classes on healthy behaviors. And actually, a 2009 National Academy of Sciences report on preventable mental, emotional, and behavioral problems in young people found that effective classroom-based programs were, in fact, very effective in changing their behavior. But those are individual, one person at a time. So coming to the environmental strategies, these take a much broader approach than those individual level strategies. Prevention professionals will use environmental strategies to change the conditions within a community, including the physical, social, or cultural factors that may lead to substance use. For example, prevention planners may decide to target laws or norms that are favorable towards alcohol misuse or illegal substance use. Environmental strategies are most effective when implemented as part of a comprehensive approach. Now, those environmental strategies, they include communication and education strategies, which seek to influence community norms by raising awareness and creating community support for prevention. Environmental strategies may also use enforcement methods to deter people and organizations from illegal substance use. Environmental strategies allow us to devote resources with a focus on population level change in the community rather than individual level change. More emphasis is placed on strategies that impact the social, political, legal, and economic context of the related problems rather than on an individual's problems. Individual strategies, they tend to be short-term, and there is a close relationship between the individual and the issue at hand. Environmental strategies are long-term and affect an entire population. When we look at things on an environmental level, individuals can serve as advocates for necessary change in policy and societal norms that will benefit a greater number of people. Examples of these longer-term impacts can include such things as changes in laws or policies. These can be focused on availability of alcohol to minors and locations where underage drinking may occur. While the focus is on environmental change, it does not have to be an either or approach. There are benefits at times to targeting individual behavior. However, the greater impact on long-term, sustained results are derived from implementation of environmental strategies. And you can use the individual-based efforts to serve as a complement to the community's overall environmental approach. So a few examples. Environmental strategies, they break it down to communication and education, like I mentioned. You work to change policy and build community support. And then you've also got the enforcement piece, which is very important, and often many will put that aside and consider that not a part of prevention. But enforcement is very much a part of prevention. In fact, it can actually be the very first step in prevention. So breaking down communication and education. Messages communicated through the media influence how the public thinks and behaves. Communication strategies, public education, social marketing, media advocacy, they can all be used to influence community norms, increase public awareness, and attract community support for a variety of prevention issues. Public education is designed to increase the public's knowledge and awareness of a particular health issue. These campaigns may combine public service announcements on television, radio, or online with billboards and posters. Familiar public education slogans include, "Friends don't let friends drive drunk." "A mind is a terrible thing to waste." We've all heard those. So now, social marketing. It involves using advertising principles to change the social norms and promote healthy behaviors. Like public education, social marketing uses multiple media channels to message targeted groups of individuals. However, social marketing campaigns do more than provide information. They try to persuade people to adopt a new behavior by showing them the benefit that they'll gain by doing so. Then media advocacy. It attempts to shape the way social issues are discussed in the media. The goal is to build support for changes in public policy or laws. Working directly with outlets to change both the amount of coverage the media provides and the content of that coverage. Media advocacy hopes to influence the way people think and talk about public policy. All right, so enforcement. You've got surveillance, penalties, fines, and detention, community policing. But enforcement and policy, they are so closely connected. But it's important to remember that policies are unlikely to be successful without enforcement. Effective enforcement requires visibility. People need to see that the substance use prevention is a community priority and that violating related laws and regulations will result in consequences. Surveillance may include the use of compliance checks and other efforts to determine if people are complying with existing laws. Examples of surveillance and environmental strategies to address underage drinking include prohibiting sales to minors and compliance checks. But penalties and fines. These strategies create consequences for people or institutions that don't comply with an existing policy. And then community policing. It encourages citizens and community members to participate in prevention efforts. This could include neighborhood watches, efforts to remove sources of alcohol or drugs, and partnering with law enforcement to discourage underage drinking or substance misuse. So I often hear that the law enforcement's role is only enforcement. Simply write tickets, make arrests, and enforce the laws. The prevention specialist will handle the prevention part. But enforcement is much more than writing tickets or making arrests. It plays a larger role in the big comprehensive approach to prevention. You know, it plays that vital role in restricting access, in decreasing related negative consequences, influencing community norms, and increasing the perceived risk. Enforcement is a part of creating that environmental change. And this comes back to the deterrence theory. Deterrence requires the perception that violations will lead to certain, swift, and appropriately severe punishments. Of the three legs of the deterrence theory, colleges and communities should focus on the certainty and swiftness rather than the severity. These are the more important legs of the deterrence theory as it relates to colleges and communities based on the research. But it's very much a vital and important part. I talked about influencing community norms. What the law enforcement enforce and how they enforce it, and how that information is communicated to the local community is going to help show and reinforce what the norms are for that community. What's acceptable behavior? What's not acceptable behavior? It all helps establish those community norms. It's very important. So some of the elements of effective prevention strategies, they require the right blend of policy, enforcement, and public support. Now, each of these components will play an important part in your success. And if you remove any one of those components, you won't have what it takes to make and sustain positive change. Policies and law are of no use and do not create the desired deterrent effect if they're not enforced. They go hand in hand. But enforcement, that requires public support in the way of resources and infrastructure. So they are all interrelated and complement each other. And I've got to talk about collaboration. So we need to build that bridge and bring law enforcement more into our overall prevention efforts. Collaboration is vital. You won't be able to implement environmental change strategies unless you collaborate. Now, unlike those strategies that target individual behavior, environmental prevention strategies focus on creating an atmosphere that makes it easier for people to act in healthy ways. These strategies do this by changing the culture and the context within where they make those decisions, influencing the community standards, the institutions, or structures that shape individual behaviors. Now, ideally, the most effective prevention approaches are those that include a blend of environmental strategies that align with and reinforce prevention strategies directed at individuals. However, the success of these strategies relies on the involvement of multiple partners. You've got to work across multiple settings. In other words, environmental strategies require successful collaboration. So here we're coming back to the SPIF. Like I said, this is an excellent foundation to guide and drive your prevention efforts. So what does collaboration look like across each step of the SPIF? Assessment. You're going to be gathering your data. You're going to look for those gaps in the data. You're going to try to go out and get the information that you need to fill those gaps. When it comes to capacity building, you're building your prevention team. You're building your readiness. You're building that support. And then planning. You've identified your risk and protective factors from your assessment. So now you're going to prioritize those. Then you start selecting the appropriate interventions and start drafting your comprehensive prevention plan. Then when you move into implementation, you work to raise community awareness, ensure interventions are implemented with fidelity, and continue to build those infrastructure supports. And then lastly, but not least, evaluation. You're going to be conducting evaluation that meets the stakeholders' needs, not just your own needs, because you've brought everybody to the table to work together as you collaborate to determine the best prevention strategies. And you're going to share those lessons learned with each other so you can make changes and continue to improve and adapt and adjust. So what does collaboration look like across the SPIF with law enforcement? It brings you to the first one, assessment. Law enforcement has some great data that can really help drive your prevention efforts. The arrest or citation data, but then also the related calls for service where they might not have made an arrest or issued a citation. Might just be a student conduct code violation or just writing a written report or a verbal warning. But if alcohol or other drugs were involved, it'd be nice to know about that and bring that into your assessment as you're running through the SPIF process. And medical transports, then hotspots. The campus and community are going to look a lot different during the daytime than they do at 12 o'clock or 1 a.m. on a Thursday, Friday, or Saturday. Law enforcement are out there on the front lines, and they will have a good pulse on where the underage drinking, where the large house parties, where the popular bars are, where the trouble spots are. They're also going to be able to give you the current trends from the field. And this actually reminds me of previous training that I had put on, I believe it was last year, with a DRE, a drug recognition expert. He brought the latest drug trends from the campus community, and the specialists that were in the room loved that information. They hadn't even been aware of it. They didn't know what to ask, what to look for. Housing staff didn't know what to look for in the residence halls. So there's a lot of knowledge and information that you can get from collaborating with law enforcement and bringing them on board, bringing them to the table through the entire process. And I'm going to drive that point home. They should be involved through the entire process. I was working with a group in New Mexico this last year, and they wanted to engage law enforcement. They'd already gone through the SPIF process, and they were ready to implement. They're like, hey, Dave, we've got our data, we've started building capacity, we've got our strategic plans, we know what strategies we want to use, and they all came back to law enforcement. They were law enforcement strategies. Okay, so now how do we go engage law enforcement and get them to go do these strategies? Well, guys, you kind of got ahead of yourselves here. If they would have included law enforcement in the entire process, law enforcement would have already been on board and said, hey, yeah, these are great strategies. I see why you're doing this. I understand prevention. I understand the data. Let's go. But instead, they had to go knock on the police department's door and say, hey, my name's Dave Closson, and I'm a prevention specialist. I've looked at the data. I know what needs to be done to make some changes with the underage drinking. Here's some strategies that you need to be doing. That's not going to be received very well. Imagine somebody knocking on your office door saying, hey, I'm an expert. You need to do this, 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 and this, because what you're doing isn't working. When you include them from the beginning, it makes a big difference. It really does. But all right, sorry, I digress. Capacity. This is another thing. Collaboration is great. Facilitating trainings, bringing prevention specialists and law enforcement together. That cross-training, that partnership. You're going to learn just that much more. You can teach law enforcement about harm reduction, about prevention messaging. You can even explain that, drunk goggles, yeah, they're fun, but guess what? They don't work. And also through building capacity, law enforcement, if they're on your team, they might be able to bring some more stakeholders to the table as well that you might not already have a relationship with, but they do. Then as you move into planning, if everybody understands the factors that are associated with the identified and prioritized problems, they're going to be more motivated to address them because they're going to understand why. It relates back to Simon Sinek. Start with why. If somebody understands the why, they're going to be more likely and more driven, more motivated to move forward. And as you're selecting the appropriate interventions with law enforcement there, if you identify some law enforcement strategies, they might say, hey, this is great. It looks good on paper, but we don't have the staffing to be able to carry this out, or we don't have enough funding to be able to carry this strategy out. Or our state's attorney or local ordinance violations, the local policy won't really support this. So you're able to actually identify those interventions, filter those out ahead of time, and select ones that are a best fit for everyone, and bring that into your comprehensive prevention plan. Then raising community awareness, you've got a unified message. That was what was great when I was out on patrol. I knew the prevention messaging that the Health Education Resource Center was using on campus and student conduct was using on campus. And I knew what messaging the housing staff was using and putting out on campus. So I was able to put out the same messaging to support theirs, and they were supporting what I was putting out there. It worked great. It really did. And then also for the infrastructure, as a crime prevention officer, I was invited and then trained to be able to co-facilitate some of the alcohol sanction classes. And this was great because if one individual, one of the other facilitators, had a meeting or wasn't able to attend, guess what? We had each other's backs and we had it covered because we were both trained on it. And we're still able to carry forward and provide those sanctions to the students to get them started and moving forward in the change process. Then evaluation. You're going to want to know the results from the enforcement efforts. And the law enforcement, they're going to want to know the type of change that is going on from the student surveys, from the core survey. They're going to want to know, hey, guess what? We are making a difference. This is great. We need to keep this up. But then also you can identify obstacles, what worked and what didn't work, so you can make changes as you move forward. But all in all, law enforcement does need to have a seat at the table through the entire strategic planning process, regardless of if you follow the SPIF or your own planning process. The more they are involved, the more that's going to increase their buy-in, the more that's going to build your relationship with them, the more they're going to understand the problem and be motivated and driven to start creating some environmental change and using those environmental strategies. So some of the principles of collaboration, because this is something, collaboration is so important to me and it makes such a big difference. You've got to be intentional. You can't just expect it to happen. Set a plan and go out and be purposeful about building relationships and engaging with law enforcement. But also be flexible. Officers work on shifts, first shift, second shift, midnight shift. They might not necessarily be available for your committee meeting at 1 in the afternoon because they just got off work at 7 a.m. Think about that. Be a little flexible. Find that common ground where you can come in and get together. Also, all parties must benefit. Don't just show up on the door and with a list of demands or a list of strategies. See how you can help them, what you can do to make their job easier. You want that win-win. But then also not one size fits all. Every police department, every campus, every department on campus, they're going to have their own unique little different culture, little nuances. You can't just come in with one set elevator pitch and expect that to work with every police department. So take time to really get to know them and see what works for them. And I talked on time as far as being flexible, but then also the last one, it's a journey, not a destination. And that is so true. And think about just any kind of relationship that you have with a friend, family, coworker. It's not, okay, we're friends now, good, and you can just sit back and do nothing. It's a journey. You've got to continue to build those relationships. Always keep working on those. Don't just say, all right, we got you to the table for the coalition, we're good. Now you've got to keep working to build and maintain those healthy relationships. So a fun little side story, because who doesn't love stories, right? So this was the EIU Mayhem Prevention Team, and it was one of my fun projects while I was a crime prevention officer. And essentially, we brought together all of the offices and departments listed here. And as a group, we decided and brainstormed what was the best way to get the police departments involved in prevention messaging. We wanted to be a part of it. We didn't want to be left out. We didn't want to just show up and write citations. We wanted to get out in front of things. And so we took the lovely EIU blue wig and put it on me and tried to parody the Allstate Mayhem commercials. We had posters and photos for social media. And then we went through and actually made some YouTube videos with safe party tips, with drinking, with drug use, with housing, how to be a good neighbor. And it was a lot of fun. But quite frankly, me as a crime prevention officer, if I wanted to do this by myself, in no way would I have been able to do that. We were able to share resources, share ideas, and not just through sharing resources, got a lot of knowledge. Working with the Health Education Resource Center, Student Community Service, and Student Standards, they helped the two police departments shape the messaging to more effective harm reduction messaging. It also extended the reach of those messages, because it wasn't just the EIU Police Department. It wasn't just me putting it out over our Facebook or our Twitter. It was everybody putting it out over theirs, sharing it, sending it out. And then we also brought in the housing, the residents' life and housing on campus. They would put the videos and pictures out over their social media networks. Multiplied our reach tenfold. And again, it was a lot of fun. It was. So I really enjoyed it. But yes, creative collaboration. Find ways to bring law enforcement into your other prevention efforts, not just enforcement. You might be surprised. You might have some good actors there that love to rock a blue wig and aviators. And in fact, I do still have those aviators. Not quite sure where that blue wig is, though. Might need to do some looking after the webinar today. All right, so if you'll take a moment, I'm curious, which of the following law enforcement agencies are actively involved in your prevention efforts right now? Go ahead and drop that in the chat box if you can. Just curious to see your level of collaboration at the time. I'll give just a few minutes. So what's interesting, as I've been working with other campus law enforcement agencies across the country, some campuses might be working really closely with their state law enforcement, with the state troopers. They might have a special alcohol unit that comes around and works on campus, but they might not be engaged with the local city law enforcement, or for some reason, they're not really engaged or involved with the on-campus law enforcement. But what you can do is, if you have a great partnership with one of those, any of those, they can open the door to the other agencies and help bring them to the seat at the table. So it's working through those partnerships and expanding your reach. All right, so it looks like the chat box might not be working, so we'll go ahead and keep moving forward. If it pops up and I get some feedback from you, I'll go ahead and address that. I'll keep an eye on the chat. But again, just think about, which ones would be your first ones, the most likely to really come to the table and start to engage with you around your prevention efforts. And start there. And then from there, you can work out to then build relationships with the other agencies. All right, so environmental prevention strategies that relate to law enforcement. Essentially, you can look at them these three ways: limiting access, enforcement, and community norms. And those three all work together. They all work together. Enforcement, you can use enforcement to help limit access. Through enforcement, just like we talked about earlier, you can use that as far as the deterrence theory and increased perception of risk. And through that enforcement, like I said, you're going to be addressing and influencing the community norms. And then same thing with limiting access. They all play off of each other and they're all a vital part. You can't do one without the other and expect to be very successful in creating large-scale environmental change. All right, so limiting access. You know, limiting access, these are some of the most powerful and well-documented approaches to reducing underage drinking and the related problems. These strategies are very effective in shaping the social, economic, and physical environments in which young people make decisions about drinking. Now, compliance checks, it's essentially just that. You'll have an underage decoy volunteer go in and attempt to purchase alcohol. And if they are successful, then the officers will go in and issue a citation or the appropriate sanction to that establishment. And prescription drug monitoring program, prescription drug take back. We've seen a big uptick in prescription drug misuse and abuse. Different ways to do that, to controlling access, monitoring them, allowing take back. If you have a drug take back day or multiple days or a drop box at the local police department where people can return the prescription drugs that they haven't used, that's going to limit access because it's not going to be available in their room, their residence hall, or their house. Then party patrol with the social host ordinance law. Those go together so closely. Like I had said earlier, enforcement goes right hand in hand with policy. But through using a social host ordinance or law to address parties, that's going to limit access as well. You won't have as many large-scale house parties with underage drinking. And then responsible beverage seller server training. That's going to train your bartenders, your servers, and it's going to teach them how to identify if somebody is too intoxicated and they need to cut them off and not serve them anymore. It's going to teach them and train them how to check IDs properly so they're not serving underage individuals. It's going to be controlling access. And a fun little case study from Eastern Illinois University. Yes, indeed. I'll use EIU for short. EIU built partnerships and raised awareness of the drinking problem. They educated decision makers who then passed an ordinance to limit underage access to alcohol at restaurants with liquor licenses. The efforts provided free training in English and in Spanish for bar owners and their staff. That responsible beverage seller and server training in English and in Spanish. They followed this training up with regular compliance checks by law enforcement. And strict controls were placed on venues serving alcohol during athletic events. They paired all that limiting access with high visibility enforcement. Increased enforcement during the first 6 weeks of the school year established campus and community norms for legal community environments. And law enforcement increased alcohol citations in the first year. And they had a 40% decrease in underage drinking citations in year 2. So they stepped up their enforcement the first year. So of course they saw an increase in citations. They maintained that same level of enforcement and saw a 40% decrease in underage drinking citations just in the second year alone. That's pretty quick to see that big of a change. That really indicated that bars and the students had responded to those interventions. Some of the results, they passed an ordinance that requires restaurants with liquor licenses to operate as restaurants the entire time they are open. They reduced the late bar hours and required 2 ID checking process. There were also standard operating procedures for referrals from the Charleston Police Department off campus in the community, referring their reports of off-campus violations to the Office of Student Standards on campus, all through collaboration. And then I've also got on here the Good Neighbor Project that weren't included in this UDL study. Now, that was another collaboration where housing, student government, student conduct, student affairs, the mayor, the president of the university, the city police, campus police, the fire department. At the beginning of this fall semester, we would go around to the off-campus college student housing areas where the students would rent houses and apartments adjacent to campus. And we would just go door to door and introduce ourselves and just welcome them to town. We would have a goodie bag with some sweet swag for them, but that included prevention messaging. It was another way to get out there and talk to the students and get ahead of the things. We had Party Smart, Be a Good Neighbor, tips for them. I talked about being able to co-facilitate the alcohol sanction classes. We had talked about having the unified harm reduction message, but then also motivational interviewing. That's what I really loved. As I learned about motivational interviewing while doing the alcohol sanctioning classes, I took that out with me on patrol and started sharing that same strategy with my fellow officers. Taking motivational interviewing out to the students to reach that many more students and create that jump start to change before they entered into the student conduct process to receive even more motivational interviewing. So it was a lot of fun stuff. And big things were happening in Eastern, and it really did create environmental change. The students and the community responded to it. All right, so back to strategies, back to enforcement. DUI checkpoints, party patrols, enforcing the minimum drinking age, and specialized drug units. I'll come back, I'll say it again, enforcement, you've got to have it. I often hear from campus police officers across the country that they don't feel like they have support on their campus or in their community to actually go out and enforce the campus rules and regulations and the laws. They feel like they're going to be hurting a student's life. They're setting them up to ruin their life. They don't feel like the administration wants them to write tickets to the students. But the research shows that officers underestimate the amount of support they have for enforcement on a regular basis. So one thing that you can do as a prevention specialist on campus or in the community is let those officers know that you do support their enforcement efforts, that you want them to go out and have consistent and fair enforcement, because enforcement can be the very first step in prevention, in creating that behavior change. Many times it might be a college student's first interaction around substance misuse. It's going to involve law enforcement. So if by taking 5 minutes to use a little motivational interviewing, or to take the time to write a student conduct code citation and refer them to the student conduct process, where they can enter into an evidence-based intervention, that might be what sets them in the right direction towards changing their high-risk behavior. It all can start right there. So the more you can communicate your support of their prevention efforts or their enforcement efforts, the better off it will be. So another little case study, and this comes from California, the Safer California Universities Project. And this included a comprehensive community-based program that focused on the first weeks of the academic year and comprises several alcohol control measures, enforcement of underage sales, roadside DUI operations, social host party patrols with the local ordinances, along with a multifaceted media advocacy campaign with channels unique to the college students. This was funded by the NIAAA, and they found significant reductions in the incidence and likelihood of intoxication at off-campus parties and bars at the safer intervention universities compared to the controlled schools. A lower likelihood of intoxication was observed also for the safer intervention universities the last time students drank at an off-campus party. So at the safer intervention schools, the students weren't reaching as high of a level of intoxication at any setting, whether it was at a bar or just drinking off campus. Stronger evidence of the intervention's effects were achieved at the safer universities with the highest level of implementation. The research concluded that environmental prevention strategies targeting settings where the majority of heavy drinking events occur appear to be effective in reducing the incidence and likelihood of intoxication among college students. The impact was equivalent to 6,000 fewer incidents of intoxication at off-campus parties, and 4,000 fewer incidents at bars and restaurants during the fall semester at the safer interventions schools compared to the controlled schools. It really did make a difference. So moving on to the community norms. Unified messaging from all stakeholders. Pair that with limiting access and pair that with enforcement. What is enforced helps communicate to the community the norms if there's good community support. Strategies designed to express a community norm against use are powerful and a valid approach, especially in conjunction with other efforts, bringing it back to that comprehensive approach. I already touched on social marketing and media advocacy and social norms earlier, but the last one, visibility. You've got to communicate your enforcement efforts. You can do this both before, during, and after. And when it comes to compliance checks or your DUI patrols, your party patrols, it's okay. Feel free to put it out there that you'll be stepping up your enforcement efforts, but then also communicate your results. There's actually a trooper out east. This is a fun story that I always like to share. I'll give you the Cliff Notes version because I know we're starting to get close to the end of the webinar and I want to respect your time. But this trooper had a big area where he was the only officer patrolling it. But he would start on a Thursday. He would send out a press release to the local media outlets saying, hey, the such and such DUI task force will be out patrolling this weekend. And that was it. Okay. They started to run with it and they would put this out there. Then Monday morning, he would send the results. The such and such DUI task force made this many vehicle stops, made this many DUI arrests, this many open container citations, reporting the results. This got so much momentum in the community, in the area, the local police departments were saying, hey, trooper, how can we be a part of this DUI task force? We want in on this. This is great. The trooper would just smile and say, you guys, there's no DUI task force. I'm just putting out my own activity for the weekend. How many stops I made, how many DUI arrests I made. But because he put that message out there, it made an impact. It got everybody's attention. So don't be afraid to put that out there. And with compliance checks, don't just put out the establishments that did not pass the compliance check. The ones that do pass, give them a pat on the back. Let them know that they did a good job at positive reinforcement. But communication, that high visibility campaign, put the enforcement efforts out there. Get that community support and then start marketing, start promoting, using the media. They all work together in that comprehensive approach to create change. And these are avenues where you can really help the law enforcement shape their messaging, because you've got the foundation knowledge on social norms, marketing, media advocacy, and social marketing. Bringing law enforcement to the table throughout the entire process, helping them bringing them in as you build your comprehensive plan. You can guide their message and teach them so when they do put their messaging out there, it is that much more effective and in line with yours. And these are what's going to help shift and shape the community norms. Another little case study from just down the road here at Eastern would be the University of Illinois. And for those throughout the state, I'm sure you're familiar with unofficial St. Patrick's Day. What they did to address this large-scale, high-risk drinking event, they built community partnerships to increase buy-in from campus officials to support enforcement and implemented alcohol policies to deter underage drinking. The advent of a multi-jurisdictional enforcement operations and event management training yielded campus and community collaborations for strict alcohol control policies. They had high visibility enforcement, but they also had informational campaigns about alcohol policies, the laws, and the consequences to reduce underage drinking incidences during the regularly occurring high-risk yet unsanctioned unofficial St. Patrick's Day event. The University of Illinois implemented their high visibility enforcement during this event. And what that resulted in was an increase in citations and arrests from 269 in 2009 to 364 in 2011. Their community partnerships increased buy-in. And they used that buy-in to get support. Then they use that support to also drive their enforcement and really create a shift in the norms. So I said that it went up to 364 in 2011, but they've maintained their same efforts. They've been able to sustain their enforcement, their prevention messaging, and they've really created a change in the community norms such that, like I said, 364 in 2011, 2015, citations and arrests, 138. 2016, 160. So it went from 364 down to 138 and 160. They really have been creating environmental change through that comprehensive approach and collaboration. And so just a few of the highlights again to wrap things up, because I know we're getting towards the end of our time. Comprehensive approach, it's the way to go. Collaboration, bringing law enforcement to the table at the beginning of your strategic planning process, whether it be using the SPIF or your own planning process. Bringing them to the table is going to teach them about prevention, is going to build your relationship with them, increase their buy-in, and you're going to be able to share resources, knowledge, and work together and expand your reach to make a bigger impact on creating environmental change. And then enforcement. It is a vital part of the prevention piece. You've got to have it to create environmental change. Support it, encourage it, and let them know that you want the officers to go out there and use consistent and fair enforcement, because it really can be the first step in changing a student's life for the better. And the communication. Communicate, communicate, communicate with your stakeholders at the table, with your community, and your campus. Let them know about your prevention efforts. Let them know about your collaboration, that you're working together, because it's a community issue and you are coming together as a community with law enforcement, with the prevention specialists, with the campus, with the community to really make that change. Put it out there. Don't be shy and don't be afraid to communicate your efforts. And if the chat is working, or if there are any questions, that essentially brings things to a close. I see a question. I've got to see how to view it. Okay. All It looks like it's not quite working. If you have any questions, though, feel free to shoot them to the IHEC staff, and they can relay them to me, and I'd be happy to share some more strategies with you on how you can engage your local law enforcement, how you can bring them into your particular prevention efforts and prevention strategies, or anything else that I can do to help you out. I really do appreciate you taking time out of your days to join this webinar, and thank you to the IHEC staff for allowing me this opportunity. Always glad to help out, and I'm always here to help. I'll turn it back over to the IHEC staff. Thank you all very much.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Dave. And again, if anybody has any questions, please feel free to shoot me an email, and I would be happy to answer those the best of my abilities or pass that along to Dave. I'll be sharing Dave's contact information with everyone, as well as in the next couple of days, this webinar will be up on our website. Again, thanks everyone so much, and have a great day.